of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 98. And now it happened that the fortunes of Philip Carey, of no consequence to any but himself, were affected by the events through which his country was passing. History was being made, and the process was so significant that it seemed absurd it should touch the life of an obscure medical student. Battle after battle, Magersfontein, Colenso, Spion Kop, lost on the playing fields of Eton, had humiliated the nation and dealt the death blow to the prestige of the aristocracy and gentry who till then had found no one seriously to oppose their assertion that they possessed a natural instinct of government. The old order was being swept away. History was being made indeed. Then the Colossus put forth his strength, and, blundering again, at last blundered into the semblance of victory. Cronje surrendered at Paardeberg, Ladysmith was relieved, and at the beginning of March Lord Roberts marched into Bloemfontein. It was 2 or 3 days after the news of this reached London that Macalister came into the tavern in Beak Street and announced joyfully that things were looking brighter on the Stock Exchange. Peace was in sight. Roberts would march into Pretoria within a few weeks, and shares were going up already. There was bound to be a boom. "Now's the time to come in," he told Philip. "It's no good waiting till the public gets on to it. It's now or never." He had inside information. The manager of a mine in South Africa had cabled to the senior partner of his firm that the plant was uninjured. They would start working again as soon as possible. It wasn't a speculation, it was an investment. To show how good a thing the senior partner thought it, Macalister told Philip that he had bought 500 shares for both his sisters. He never put into anything that wasn't as safe as the Bank of England. "I'm going to put my shirt on it myself," he said. The shares were 2 1/8 to a quarter. He advised Philip not to be greedy, but to be satisfied with a 10-shilling rise. He was buying 300 for himself, and suggested that Philip should do the same. He would hold them and sell them when he thought fit. Philip had great faith in him, partly because he was a Scotsman and therefore by nature cautious, and partly because he had been right before. He jumped at the suggestion. "I dare say we shall be able to sell before the account," said Macalister, "but if not, I'll arrange to carry them over for you." It seemed a capital system to Philip. You held on till you got your profit, and you never even had to put your hand in your pocket. He began to watch the Stock Exchange columns of the paper with new interest. Next day everything was up a little, and Macalister wrote to say that he had to pay 2 1/4 for the shares. He said that the market was firm. But in a day or two there was a setback. The news that came from South Africa was less reassuring, and Philip with anxiety saw that his shares had fallen to 2. But Macalister was optimistic. The Boers couldn't hold out much longer, and he was willing to bet a top hat that Roberts would march into Johannesburg before the middle of April. At the account Philip had to pay out nearly £40. It worried him considerably, but he felt that the only course was to hold on. In his circumstances the loss was too great for him to pocket. For 2 or 3 weeks nothing happened. The Boers would not understand that they were beaten and nothing remained for them but to surrender. In fact, they had 1 or 2 small successes, and Philip's shares fell half a crown more. It became evident that the war was not finished. There was a lot of selling. When Macalister saw Philip he was pessimistic. "I'm not sure if the best thing wouldn't be to cut the loss. I've been paying out about as much as I want to in differences." Philip was sick with anxiety. He could not sleep at night. He bolted his breakfast, reduced now to tea and bread and butter, in order to get over to the club reading room and see the paper. Sometimes the news was bad, and sometimes there was no news at all, but when the shares moved it was to go down. He did not know what to do. If he sold now he would lose altogether hard on £350, and that would leave him only £80 to go on with. He wished with all his heart that he had never been such a fool as to dabble on the Stock Exchange, but the only thing was to hold on. Something decisive might happen any day, and the shares would go up. He did not hope now for a profit, but he wanted to make good his loss. It was his only chance of finishing his course at the hospital. The summer session was beginning in May, and at the end of it he meant to take the examination in midwifery. Then he would only have a year more. He reckoned it out carefully and came to the conclusion that he could manage it, fees and all, on £150. But that was the least it could possibly be done on. Early in April he went to the tavern in Beak Street, anxious to see Macalister. It eased him a little to discuss the situation with him, and to realize that numerous people beside himself were suffering from loss of money made his own trouble a little less tolerable. But when Philip arrived, no one was there but Hayward, and no sooner had Philip seated himself than he said, "I'm sailing for the Cape on Sunday." "Are you?" exclaimed Philip. Hayward was the last person he would have expected to do anything of the kind. At the hospital men were going out now in numbers. The government was glad to get anyone who was qualified, and others, going out as troopers, wrote home that they had been put on hospital work as soon as it was learned that they were medical students. A wave of patriotic feeling had swept over the country, and volunteers were coming from all ranks of society. "What are you going as?" asked Philip. "Oh, in the Dorset Yeomanry. I'm going as a trooper." Philip had known Hayward for 8 years. The youthful intimacy which had come from Philip's enthusiastic admiration for the man who could tell him of art and literature had long since vanished. But habit had taken its place, and when Hayward was in London they saw one another once or twice a week. He still talked about books with a delicate appreciation. Philip was not yet tolerant, and sometimes Hayward's conversation irritated him. He no longer believed implicitly that nothing in the world was of consequence but art. He resented Hayward's contempt for action and success. Philip, stirring his punch, thought of his early friendship and his ardent expectation that Hayward would do great things. It was long since he had lost all such illusions, and he knew now that Hayward would never do anything but talk. He found his 300 a year more difficult to live on now that he was 35 than he had when he was a young man. And his clothes, though still made by a good tailor, were worn a good deal longer than at one time he would have thought possible. He was too stout, and no artful arrangement of his fair hair could conceal the fact that he was bald. His blue eyes were dull and pale. It was not hard to guess that he drank too much. "What on earth made you think of going out to the Cape?" asked Philip. "Oh, I don't know. I thought I ought to." Philip was silent. He felt rather silly. He understood that Hayward was being driven by an uneasiness in his soul which he could not account for. Some power within him made it seem necessary to go and fight for his country. It was strange, since he considered patriotism no more than a prejudice, and, flattering himself on his cosmopolitanism, he had looked upon England as a place of exile. His countrymen in the mass wounded his susceptibilities. Philip wondered what it was that made people do things which were so contrary to all their theories of life. It would have been reasonable for Hayward to stand aside and watch with a smile while the barbarians slaughtered one another. It looked as though men were puppets in the hands of an unknown force which drove them to do this and that, and sometimes they used their reason to justify their actions. And when this was impossible, they did the actions in despite of reason. "People are very extraordinary," said Philip. "I should never have expected you to go out as a trooper." Hayward smiled, slightly embarrassed, and said nothing. "I was examined yesterday," he remarked at last. "It was worth while undergoing the gene of it to know that one was perfectly fit." Philip noticed that he still used the French word in an affected way when an English one would have served. But just then Macalister came in. "I wanted to see you, Carey," he said. "My people don't feel inclined to hold those shares any more. The market's in such an awful state, and they want you to take them up." Philip's heart sank. He knew that was impossible. It meant that he must accept the loss. His pride made him answer calmly. "I don't know that I think that's worth while. You'd better sell them." "It's all very fine to say that. I'm not sure if I can. The market's stagnant. There are no buyers." "But they're marked down at 1 1/8." "Oh, yes, but that doesn't mean anything. You can't get that for them." Philip did not say anything for a moment. He was trying to collect himself. "Do you mean to say they're worth nothing at all?" "Oh, I don't say that. Of course they're worth something, but you see nobody's buying them now." "Then you must just sell them for what you can get." Macalister looked at Philip narrowly. He wondered whether he was very hard hit. "I'm awfully sorry, old man, but we're all in the same boat. No one thought the war was going to hang on this way. I put you into them, but I was in myself too." "It doesn't matter at all," said Philip. "One has to take one's chances." He moved back to the table from which he had got up to talk to Macalister. He was dumbfounded. His head suddenly began to ache furiously. But he did not want them to think him unmanly. He sat on for an hour. He laughed feverishly at everything they said. At last he got up to go. "You take it pretty coolly," said Macalister, shaking hands with him. "I don't suppose anyone likes losing between 300 and 400 pounds." When Philip got back to his shabby little room, he flung himself on his bed and gave himself over to his despair. He kept on regretting his folly bitterly. And though he told himself that it was absurd to regret, for what had happened was inevitable just because it had happened, he could not help himself. He was utterly miserable. He could not sleep. He remembered all the ways he had wasted money during the last few years. His head ached dreadfully. The following evening there came by the last post the statement of his account. He examined his pass-book. He found that when he had paid everything he would have £7 left. £7. He was thankful he had been able to pay. It would have been horrible to be obliged to confess to Macalister that he had not the money. He was dressing in the eye department during the summer session, and he had bought an ophthalmoscope off a student who had one to sell. He had not paid for this, but he lacked the courage to tell the student that he wanted to go back on his bargain. Also he had to buy certain books. He had about £5 to go on with. It lasted him 6 weeks. Then he wrote to his uncle a letter which he thought very businesslike. He said that owing to the war he had had grave losses and could not go on with his studies unless his uncle came to his help. He suggested that the vicar should lend him £150, paid over the next 18 months in monthly instalments. He would pay interest on this and promised to refund the capital by degrees when he began to earn money. He would be qualified in a year and a half at the latest, and he could be pretty sure then of getting an assistantship at £3 a week. His uncle wrote back that he could do nothing. It was not fair to ask him to sell out when everything was at its worst, and the little he had he felt that his duty to himself made it necessary for him to keep in case of illness. He ended the letter with a little homily. He had warned Philip time after time, and Philip had never paid any attention to him. He could not honestly say he was surprised. He had long expected that this would be the end of Philip's extravagance and want of balance. Philip grew hot and cold when he read this. It had never occurred to him that his uncle would refuse, and he burst into furious anger. But this was succeeded by utter blankness. If his uncle would not help him, he could not go on at the hospital. Panic seized him and, putting aside his pride, he wrote again to the vicar of Blackstable, placing the case before him more urgently. But perhaps he did not explain himself properly, and his uncle did not realise in what desperate straits he was, for he answered that he could not change his mind. Philip was 25, and really ought to be earning his living. When he died, Philip would come into a little, but till then he refused to give him a penny. Philip felt in the letter the satisfaction of a man who for many years had disapproved of his courses and now saw himself justified. End of chapter 98. Chapter 99. Philip began to pawn his clothes. He reduced his expenses by eating only 1 meal a day beside his breakfast, and he ate it, bread and butter and cocoa, at 4 so that it should last him till next morning. He was so hungry by 9 o'clock that he had to go to bed. He thought of borrowing money from Lawson, but the fear of a refusal held him back. At last he asked him for £5. Lawson lent it with pleasure, but, as he did so, said: "You'll let me have it back in a week or so, won't you? I've got to pay my framer, and I'm awfully broke just now." Philip knew he would not be able to return it, and the thought of what Lawson would think made him so ashamed that in a couple of days he took the money back untouched. Lawson was just going out to luncheon and asked Philip to come too. Philip could hardly eat, he was so glad to get some solid food. On Sunday he was sure of a good dinner from Athelny. He hesitated to tell the Athelnys what had happened to him. They had always looked upon him as comparatively well-to-do, and he had a dread that they would think less well of him if they knew he was penniless. Though he had always been poor, the possibility of not having enough to eat had never occurred to him. It was not the sort of thing that happened to the people among whom he lived, and he was as ashamed as if he had some disgraceful disease. The situation in which he found himself was quite outside the range of his experience. He was so taken aback that he did not know what else to do than to go on at the hospital. He had a vague hope that something would turn up. He could not quite believe that what was happening to him was true, and he remembered how during his first term at school he had often thought his life was a dream from which he would awake to find himself once more at home. But very soon he foresaw that in a week or so he would have no money at all. He must set about trying to earn something at once. If he had been qualified even with a club foot, he could have gone out to the Cape, since the demand for medical men was now great. Except for his deformity, he might have enlisted in one of the yeomanry regiments which were constantly being sent out. He went to the secretary of the medical school and asked if he could give him the coaching of some backward student, but the secretary held out no hope of getting him anything of the sort. Philip read the advertisement columns of the medical papers, and he applied for the post of unqualified assistant to a man who had a dispensary in the Fulham Road. When he went to see him, he saw the doctor glance at his club foot, and on hearing that Philip was only in his fourth year at the hospital, he said at once that his experience was insufficient. Philip understood that this was only an excuse. The man would not have an assistant who might not be as active as he wanted. Philip turned his attention to other means of earning money. He knew French and German and thought there might be some chance of finding a job as correspondence clerk. It made his heart sink, but he set his teeth. There was nothing else to do. Though too shy to answer the advertisements which demanded a personal application, he replied to those which asked for letters, but he had no experience to state and no recommendations. He was conscious that neither his German nor his French was commercial. He was ignorant of the terms used in business. He knew neither shorthand nor typewriting. He could not help recognizing that his case was hopeless. He thought of writing to the solicitor who had been his father's executor, but he could not bring himself to, for it was contrary to his express advice that he had sold the mortgages in which his money had been invested. He knew from his uncle that Mr. Nixon thoroughly disapproved of him. He had gathered from Philip's year in the accountant's office that he was idle and incompetent. "I'd sooner starve," Philip muttered to himself. Once or twice the possibility of suicide presented it to himself. It would be easy to get something from the hospital dispensary, and it was a comfort to think that if the worst came to the worst, he had at hand means of making a painless end of himself. But it was not a course that he considered seriously. When Mildred had left him to go with Griffiths, his anguish had been so great that he wanted to die in order to get rid of the pain. He did not feel like that now. He remembered that the casualty sister had told him how people oftener did away with themselves for want of money than for want of love, and he chuckled when he thought that he was an exception. He wished only that he could talk his worries over with somebody, but he could not bring himself to confess them. He was ashamed. He went on looking for work. He left his rent unpaid for 3 weeks, explaining to his landlady that he would get money at the end of the month. She did not say anything, but pursed her lips and looked grim. When the end of the month came, and she asked if it would be convenient for him to pay something on account, It made him feel very sick to say that he could not. He told her he would write to his uncle and was sure to be able to settle his bill on the following Saturday. "Well, I 'ope you will, Mr. Carey, because I 'ave my rent to pay, and I can't afford to let accounts run on." She did not speak with anger, but with determination that was rather frightening. She paused for a moment and then said: "If you don't pay next Saturday, I shall 'ave to complain to the secretary of the 'ospital." "Oh yes, that'll be all right." She looked at him for a little and glanced round the bare room. When she spoke it was without any emphasis, as though it were quite a natural thing to say. "I've got a nice 'ot joint downstairs, and if you'd like to come down to the kitchen you're welcome to a bit of dinner." Philip felt himself redden to the soles of his feet, and a sob caught at his throat. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Higgins, but I'm not at all hungry." "Very good, sir." When she left the room, Philip threw himself on his bed. He had to clench his fists in order to prevent himself from crying. Chapter 100. Saturday. It was the day on which he had promised to pay his landlady. He had been expecting something to turn up all through the week. He had found no work. He had never been driven to extremities before, and he was so dazed that he did not know what to do. He had at the back of his mind a feeling that the whole thing was a preposterous joke. He had no more than a few coppers left, he had sold all the clothes he could do without. He had some books and one or two odds and ends upon which he might have got a shilling or two, but the landlady was keeping an eye on his comings and goings. He was afraid she would stop him if he took anything more from his room. The only thing was to tell her that he could not pay his bill. He had not the courage. It was the middle of June. The night was fine and warm. He made up his mind to stay out. He walked slowly along the Chelsea Embankment, because the river was restful and quiet, till he was tired, and then sat on a bench and dozed. He did not know how long he slept. He awoke with a start, dreaming that he was being shaken by a policeman and told to move on. But when he opened his eyes he found himself alone. He walked on, he did not know why, and at last came to Chiswick, where he slept again. Presently the hardness of the bench roused him. The night seemed very long. He shivered. He was seized with a sense of his misery, and he did not know what on earth to do. He was ashamed at having slept on the Embankment. It seemed peculiarly humiliating, and he felt his cheeks flush in the darkness. He remembered stories he had heard of those who did and how among them were officers, clergymen, and men who had been to universities. He wondered if he would become one of them, standing in a line to get soup from a charitable institution. It would be much better to commit suicide. He could not go on like that. Lawson would help him when he knew what straits he was in. It was absurd to let his pride prevent him from asking for assistance. He wondered why he had become such a cropper. He had always tried to do what he thought best, and everything had gone wrong. He had helped people when he could. He did not think he had been more selfish than anyone else. It seemed horribly unjust that he should be reduced to such a pass. But it was no good thinking about it. He walked on. It was now light. The river was beautiful in the silence, and there was something mysterious in the early day. It was going to be very fine, and the sky, pale in the dawn, was cloudless. He felt very tired, and hunger was gnawing at his entrails, but he could not sit still. He was constantly afraid of being spoken to by a policeman. He dreaded the mortification of that. He felt dirty and wished he could have a wash. At last he found himself at Hampton Court. He felt that if he did not have something to eat he would cry. He chose a cheap eating-house and went in. There was a smell of hot things, and it made him feel slightly sick. He meant to eat something nourishing enough to keep up for the rest of the day, but his stomach revolted at the sight of food. He had a cup of tea and some bread and butter. He remembered then that it was Sunday, and he could go to the Athelnys'. He thought of the roast beef and the Yorkshire pudding they would eat, but he was fearfully tired and could not face the happy, noisy family. He was feeling morose and wretched. He wanted to be left alone. He made up his mind that he would go into the gardens of the palace and lie down. His bones ached. Perhaps he would find a pump so that he could wash his hands and face and drink something. He was very thirsty. And now that he was no longer hungry, he thought with pleasure of the flowers and the lawns and the great leafy trees. He felt that there he could think out better what he must do. He lay on the grass, in the shade, and lit his pipe. For economy's sake he had for a long time confined himself to 2 pipes a day. He was thankful now that his pouch was full. He did not know what people did when they had no money. Presently he fell asleep. When he awoke, it was nearly midday, and he thought that soon he must be setting out for London so as to be there in the early morning and answer any advertisements which seemed to promise. He thought of his uncle who had told him that he would leave him at his death the little he had. Philip did not in the least know how much this was. It could not be more than a few £100. He wondered whether he could raise money on the reversion. Not without the old man's consent, and that he would never give. The only thing I can do is hang on somehow till he dies. Philip reckoned his age. The vicar of Blackstable was well over 70. He had chronic bronchitis, but many old men had that and lived on indefinitely. Meanwhile, something must turn up. Philip could not get away from the feeling that his position was altogether abnormal. People in his particular station did not starve. It was because he could not bring himself to believe in the reality of his experience that he did not give way to utter despair. He made up his mind to borrow half a sovereign from Lawson. He stayed in the garden all day and smoked when he felt very hungry. He did not mean to eat anything until he was setting out again for London. It was a long way, and he must keep up his strength for that. He started when the day began to grow colder and slept on benches when he was tired. No one disturbed him. He had a wash and brush up and a shave at Victoria, some tea and bread and butter, and while he was eating this read the advertisement columns of the morning paper. As he looked down them, his eye fell upon an announcement asking for a salesman in the furnishing drapery department of some well-known stores. He had a curious little sinking of the heart, for with his middle-class prejudices it seemed dreadful to go into a shop. But he shrugged his shoulders. After all, what did it matter? And he made up his mind to have a shot at it. He had a queer feeling that by accepting every humiliation, by going out to meet it even, he was forcing the hand of fate. When he presented himself, feeling horribly shy, in the department at 9 o'clock, he found that many others were there before him. They were there of all ages, from boys of 16 to men of 40. Some were talking to one another in undertones, but most were silent. And when he took up his place, those around him gave him a look of hostility. He heard one man say, "The only thing I look forward to is getting my refusal soon enough to give me time to look elsewhere." The man standing next to him glanced at Philip and asked, "Had any experience?" "No," said Philip. He paused a moment and then made a remark. "Even the smaller houses won't see you without appointment after lunch." Philip looked at the assistants. Some were draping chintzes and cretonnes, and others, his neighbour told him, were preparing country orders that had come in by post. At about 9:15 the buyer arrived. He heard one of the men who were waiting say to another that it was Mr. Gibbons. He was middle-aged, short and corpulent, with a black beard and dark, greasy hair. He had brisk movements and a clever face. He wore a silk hat and a frock coat, the lapel of which was adorned with a white geranium surrounded by leaves. He went into his office, leaving the door open. It was very small and contained only an American roll desk in the corner, a bookcase, and a cupboard. The men standing outside watched him mechanically take the geranium out of his coat and put it in an ink pot filled with water. It was against the rules to wear flowers in business. During the day the department men who wanted to keep in with the governor admired the flower. "I've never seen better," they said. "You didn't grow it yourself?" "Yes, I did," he smiled, and a gleam of pride filled his intelligent eyes. He took off his hat and changed his coat, glanced at the letters, and then at the men who were waiting to see him. He made a slight sign with one finger, and the first in the queue stepped into the office. They filed past him one by one and answered his questions. He put them very briefly, keeping his eyes fixed on the applicant's face. Age? Experience? Why did you leave your job? He listened to the replies without expression. When it came to Philip's turn, he fancied that Mr. Gibbons stared at him curiously. Philip's clothes were neat and tolerably cut. He looked a little different from the others. Experience? I'm afraid I haven't any, said Philip. No good. Philip walked out of the office. The ordeal had been so much less painful than he expected that he felt no particular disappointment. He could hardly hope to succeed in getting a place the first time he tried. He had kept the newspaper and now looked at the advertisements again. A shop in Holborn needed a salesman too, and he went there. But when he arrived he found that someone had already been engaged. If he wanted to get anything to eat that day, he must go to Lawson's studio before he went out to luncheon, so he made his way along the Brompton Road to Yeoman's Row. "I say, I'm rather broke till the end of the month," he said, as soon as he found an opportunity. "I wish you'd lend me half a sovereign, will you?" It was incredible the difficulty he found in asking for money, and he remembered the casual way, as though almost they were conferring a favour, men at the hospital had extracted small sums out of him which they had no intention of repaying. "Like a shot," said Lawson. But when he put his hand in his pocket he found that he had only 8 shillings. Philip's heart sank. "Oh, well, lend me 5 bob, will you?" he said lightly. "Here you are." Philip went to the public baths in Westminster and spent 6 pence on a bath. Then he got himself something to eat. He did not know what to do with himself in the afternoon. He would not go back to the hospital in case anyone should ask him questions, and besides he had nothing to do there now. They would wonder in the 2 or 3 departments he had worked in why he did not come, but they must think what they chose, it did not matter. He would not be the first student who had dropped out without warning. He went to the Free Library and looked at the papers till they wearied him, then he took out Stevenson's New Arabian Nights. But he found he could not read. The words meant nothing to him, and he continued to brood over his helplessness. He kept on thinking the same things all the time, and the fixity of his thoughts made his head ache. At last, craving for fresh air, he went into the Green Park and lay down on the grass. He thought miserably of his deformity, which made it impossible for him to go to the war. He went to sleep and dreamt that he was suddenly sound of foot and out at the Cape in a regiment of yeomanry. The pictures he had looked at in the illustrated papers gave materials for his fancy, and he saw himself on the veldt, in khaki, sitting with other men round a fire at night. When he awoke he found that it was still quite light, and presently he heard Big Ben strike 7. He had 12 hours to get through with nothing to do. He dreaded the interminable night. The sky was overcast, and he feared it would rain. He would have to go to a lodging-house where he could get a bed. He had seen them advertised on lamps outside houses in Lambeth. Good beds, 6 pence. He had never been inside one, and dreaded the foul smell and the vermin. He made up his mind to stay in the open air if he possibly could. He remained in the park till it was closed, and then began to walk about. He was very tired. The thought came to him that an accident would be a piece of luck, so that he could be taken to a hospital and lie there in a clean bed for weeks. At midnight he was so hungry that he could not go without food any more, so he went to a coffee stall at Hyde Park Corner and ate a couple of potatoes and had a cup of coffee. Then he walked again. He felt too restless to sleep, and he had a horrible dread of being moved on by the police. He noted that he was beginning to look upon the constable from quite a new angle. This was the 3rd night he had spent out. Now and then he sat on the benches in Piccadilly, and towards morning he strolled down to the Embankment. He listened to the striking of Big Ben, marking every quarter of an hour, and reckoned out how long it left till the city woke again. In the morning he spent a few coppers on making himself neat and clean, bought a paper to read the advertisements, and set out once more on the search for work. He went on in this way for several days. He had very little food and began to feel weak and ill, so that he had hardly enough energy to go on looking for the work which seemed so desperately hard to find. He was growing used now to the long waiting at the back of a shop on the chance that he would be taken on, and the curt dismissal. He walked to all parts of London in answer to the advertisements, and he came to know by sight men who applied as fruitlessly as himself. One or two tried to make friends with him, but he was too tired and too wretched to accept their advances. He did not go any more to Lawson because he owed him 5 shillings. He began to be too dazed to think clearly, and ceased very much to care what would happen to him. He cried a good deal. At first he was very angry with himself for this and ashamed, but he found it relieved him and somehow made him feel less hungry. In the very early morning he suffered a good deal from cold. One night he went into his room to change his linen. He slipped in about 3, when he was quite sure everyone would be asleep, and out again at 5. He lay on the bed, and its softness was enchanting. All his bones ached, and as he lay he revelled in the pleasure of it. It was so delicious that he did not want to go to sleep. He was growing used to want of food, and did not feel very hungry, but only weak. Constantly now at the back of his mind was the thought of doing away with himself, but he used all the strength he had not to dwell on it, because he was afraid the temptation would get hold of him so that he would not be able to help himself. He kept on saying to himself that it would be absurd to commit suicide, since something must happen soon. He could not get over the impression that his situation was too preposterous to be taken quite seriously. It was like an illness which must be endured but from which he was bound to recover. Every night he swore that nothing would induce him to put up with such another, and determined next morning to write to his uncle, or to Mr. Nixon, the solicitor, or to Lawson. But when the time came, he could not bring himself to make the humiliating confession of his utter failure. He did not know how Lawson would take it. In their friendship Lawson had been scatter-brained, and he had prided himself on his common sense. He would have to tell the whole history of his folly. He had an uneasy feeling that Lawson, after helping him, would turn the cold shoulder on him. His uncle and the solicitor would of course do something for him, but he dreaded their reproaches. He did not want anyone to reproach him. He clenched his teeth and repeated that what had happened was inevitable, just because it had happened. Regret was absurd. The days were unending, and the 5 shillings Lawson had lent him would not last much longer. Philip longed for Sunday to come so that he could go to Athelny's. He did not know what prevented him from going there sooner, except perhaps that he wanted so badly to get through on his own. For Athelny, who had been in straits as desperate, was the only person who could do anything for him. Perhaps after dinner he could bring himself to tell Athelny that he was in difficulties. Philip repeated to himself over and over again what he would say to him. He was dreadfully afraid that Athelny would put him off with airy phrases. That would be so horrible that he wanted to delay as long as possible the putting of him to the test. Philip had lost all confidence in his fellows. Saturday night was cold and raw. Philip suffered horribly. From midday on Saturday till he dragged himself wearily to Athelny's house he ate nothing. He spent his last 2d on Sunday morning on a wash and a brush-up in the lavatory at Charing Cross. End of chapter 100. Chapter 101. When Philip rang, a head was put out of the window, and in a minute he heard a noisy clatter on the stairs as the children ran down to let him in. It was a pale, anxious, thin face that he bent down for them to kiss. He was so moved by their exuberant affection that, to give himself time to recover, he made excuses to linger on the stairs. He was in a hysterical state, and almost anything was enough to make him cry. They asked him why he had not come on the previous Sunday, and he told them he had been ill. They wanted to know what was the matter with him, and Philip, to amuse them, suggested a mysterious ailment, the name of which, double-barrelled and barbarous with its mixture of Greek and Latin, medical nomenclature bristled with such, made them shriek with delight. They dragged Philip into the parlour and made him repeat it for their father's edification. Athelny got up and shook hands with him. He stared at Philip, but with his round, bulging eyes he always seemed to stare. Philip did not know why on this occasion it made him self-conscious. "We missed you last Sunday," he said. Philip could never tell lies without embarrassment, and he was scarlet when he finished his explanation for not coming. Then Mrs. Athelny entered and shook hands with him. "I hope you're better, Mr. Carey," she said. He did not know why she imagined that anything had been the matter with him, for the kitchen door was closed when he came up with the children, and they had not left him. "Dinner won't be ready for another 10 minutes," she said in her slow drawl. "Won't you have an egg beaten up and a glass of milk while you're waiting?" There was a look of concern on her face which made Philip uncomfortable. He forced a laugh and answered that he was not at all hungry. Sally came in to lay the table, and Philip began to chaff her. It was the family joke that she would be as fat as an aunt of Mrs. Athelny's, called Aunt Elizabeth, whom the children had never seen, but regarded as the type of obscene corpulence. "I say, what has happened since I saw you last, Sally?" Philip began. "Nothing that I know of." "I believe you're putting on weight." "I'm sure you haven't," she retorted. "You're a perfect skeleton." Philip reddened. "That's a tu quoque, Sally," cried her father. "You will be fined 1 golden hair of your head. Jane, fetch the shears." "Well, he is thin, father," remonstrated Sally. "He's just skin and bone." "That's not the question, child. He is at perfect liberty to be thin, but your obesity is contrary to decorum." As he spoke he put his arm proudly round her waist and looked at her with admiring eyes. "Let me get on with the table, father. If I am comfortable there are some who don't seem to mind it." "The hussy!" cried Athelny, with a dramatic wave of the hand. "She taunts me with the notorious fact that Joseph, a son of Levi, who sells jewels in Holborn, has made her an offer of marriage." "Have you accepted him, Sally?" asked Philip. "Don't you know father better than that by this time? There's not a word of truth in it." "Well, if he hasn't made you an offer of marriage," cried Athelny, "by St. George and Merry England, I will seize him by the nose and demand of him immediately what are his intentions." "Sit down, father. Dinner's ready. Now then, you children, get along with you and wash your hands, all of you, and don't shirk it, because I mean to look at them before you have a scrap of dinner. So there." Philip thought he was ravenous till he began to eat, and then discovered that his stomach turned against food, and he could eat hardly at all. His brain was weary, and he did not notice that Athelny, contrary to his habit, spoke very little. Philip was relieved to be sitting in a comfortable house, but every now and then he could not prevent himself from glancing out of the window. The day was tempestuous. The fine weather had broken, and it was cold, and there was a bitter wind. Now and again gusts of rain drove against the window. Philip wondered what he should do that night. The Athelnys went to bed early, and he could not stay where he was after 10 o'clock. His heart sank at the thought of going out into the bleak darkness. It seemed more terrible now that he was with his friends than when he was outside and alone. He kept on saying to himself that there were plenty more who would be spending the night out of doors. He strove to distract his mind by talking, but in the middle of his words a spatter of rain against the window would make him start. "It's like March weather," said Athelny. "Not the sort of day one would like to be crossing the Channel." Presently they finished, and Sally came in and cleared away. "Would you like a 2-penny stinker?" said Athelny, handing him a cigar. Philip took it and inhaled the smoke with delight. It soothed him extraordinarily. When Sally had finished, Athelny told her to shut the door after her. "Now we shan't be disturbed," he said, turning to Philip. "I've arranged with Betty not to let the children come in till I call them." Philip gave him a startled look, but before he could take in the meaning of his words, Athelny, fixing his glasses on his nose with the gesture habitual to him, went on. "I wrote to you last Sunday to ask if anything was the matter with you, and as you didn't answer I went to your rooms on Wednesday." Philip turned his head away and did not answer. His heart began to beat violently. Athelny did not speak, and presently the silence seemed intolerable to Philip. He could not think of a single word to say. "Your landlady told me you hadn't been in since Saturday night, and she said you owed her for the last month. Where have you been sleeping all this week?" It made Philip sick to answer. He stared out of the window. Nowhere. "I tried to find you." "Why?" asked Philip. "Betty and I have been just as broke in our day, only we had babies to look after. Why didn't you come here?" "I couldn't." Philip was afraid he was going to cry. He felt very weak. He shut his eyes and frowned, trying to control himself. He felt a sudden flash of anger with Athelny because he would not leave him alone. But he was broken. And presently, his eyes still closed, slowly, in order to keep his voice steady, he told him the story of his adventures during the last few weeks. As he spoke, it seemed to him that he had behaved inanely, and it made it still harder to tell. He felt that Athelny would think him an utter fool. "Now you're coming to live with us till you find something to do," said Athelny, when he had finished. Philip flushed, he knew not why. "Oh, that's awfully kind of you, but I don't think I'll do that." "Why not?" Philip did not answer. He had refused instinctively from fear that he would be a bother, and he had a natural bashfulness of accepting favours. He knew besides that the Athelnys lived from hand to mouth, and with their large family had neither space nor money to entertain a stranger. "Of course you must come here," said Athelny. "Thorpe will tuck in with one of his brothers, and you can sleep in his bed. You don't suppose your food's going to make any difference to us?" Philip was afraid to speak, and Athelny, going to the door, called his wife. "Betty," he said, when she came in, "Mr. Carey's coming to live with us." "Oh, that is nice," she said. "I'll go and get the bed ready." She spoke in such a hearty, friendly tone, taking everything for granted, that Philip was deeply touched. He never expected people to be kind to him, and when they were it surprised and moved him. Now he could not prevent two large tears from rolling down his cheeks. The Athelnys discussed the arrangements and pretended not to notice to what a state his weakness had brought him. When Mrs. Athelny left them, Philip leaned back in his chair and, looking out of the window, laughed a little. "It's not a very nice night to be out, is it?" Chapter 101